Welcome to the 2015 Ida B. and Beyond Conference, presented by the School of Journalism and Electronic Media at the University of Tennessee. Held in conjunction with the Association for Education in Journalism and Mass Communications 40th Annual Southeast Colloquium. This conference is a component of the Ida B. Wells Initiative, an interdisciplinary project to foster student and scholarly research on Ida B. Wells and other social justice crusaders. The 2015 Ida B. and Beyond Conference is brought to you by UT's Ready for the World program, the Vice Chancellor for Diversity, the Commission for Blacks, the College of Communication and Information at the University of Tennessee, the School of Journalism and Electronic Media, the Department of History, and other private donations.
Thank you so much for joining us for the second session of the day. This one is entitled Beyond Ida B. Wells, considering the connection between Wells, alternative reform movements, and it's being held here, of course, at the Black Cultural Center. As I said before this morning, we are grateful for them for giving us use of this facility on campus. We will be presenting in order of the program, and in a moment I will introduce Susan I. Gray, who is the Fairfax Museum curator. She is delivering this presentation about Dr. Kate Waller Barrett's More Than a Mother to Many, it's entitled. Next on the list is James McGrath Morris, excuse me, Jamie. He is an independent scholar and biographer, and he has just released a book with Penguin Press about Ethel Payne, who is considered and was called in her time the First Lady of the Black Press. Finally, this afternoon, we have a presentation from Chandra Clark. Chandra is at Florida A&M. Don't ever do public speaking with a butterscotch in your mouth. Don't do it. Chandra's at Florida A&M University, and she's delivering a presentation today. It's called What Would Ida Do? Ascertaining the relevancy of Ida B. Wells' legacy to journalism students at an HBCU. I will be serving as both the moderator and the discussant for this afternoon's session. What that means to my kind presenters over there is I'll be sitting in the second row, and this is good to know for the future graduate students. And I will have this sign that says 5 minutes, 3 minutes, 1 minute. And once they hit their time of 15 minutes a person, I'm going to send one of you guys up to pull them off the stage, okay? This is good stuff. And then I'll also be acting as the discussant, which means that I know their papers. I'm going to bring connections between the three papers, and I'm going to facilitate the questions. And I'm really hoping this afternoon that I get a question from one of these four lovely ladies sitting in the third row. And I'm going to brag on them yet again today. I promised that I would. And it's because they're so brag-worthy. They're from neighboring Sevier County, and they recently were honored at the East Tennessee National History Day competition and will be competing in a couple of weeks at the Tennessee State competition. And they're here to give them a round of applause, seriously. And they're here today to learn even more about Ida B. Wells Barnett and to revise their amazing exhibits. And I said, I'm proud of you guys, but I'm expecting you to win national now. So I've put a lot of pressure on them. But, I mean, they've got to. We're good scholars of Ida, right? So we're the people to talk to. So without further ado, now I've rambled long enough, I will turn the floor over to Susan I. Gray, and I'll sit there with my mean and hateful signs. Thank you. It's okay to shift that. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. What a wonderful lunch and a time to you get to know several of you over lunch. And I'd like to say thank you, particularly to Amber for including this topic. And it's nice to be back in Knoxville for the second time. And today I'm going to talk to you about Dr. Kate Waller Barrett. And I'll have to start out by asking, has anyone heard of Kate Waller Barrett? Okay, well, I have a lot of work to do. I see. But if you have heard of Dr. Barrett, you've probably heard about her in connection with the Florence Crittenden Mission Homes, and some of you may have heard that term. Dr. Barrett's lifetime is really almost the same expanse as Ida B. Wells. She was born a little earlier in 1857 and died in 1925. And she was, again, a very multi-faceted personality. But what most of us know and what historians have concentrated on, and if you remember going back to this morning, most people knew about Ida B. Wells because of the anti-lynching campaign. And again, most people, if they have heard of Dr. Barrett, it's through her association with the Florence Crittenden Mission Homes. And that was an organization that she was a co-founder of that established over 70 homes across the United States and in some foreign countries. The organization provided homes, health care, maternity care, daycare, vocational training for unmarried mothers. And this is from starting in the 1890s through really the 1930s when governmental agencies began taking over some of those services. And Dr. Barrett, though, what I'm looking at today, I'm going to talk a little bit about her work with the Florence Crittenden Mission Homes because that's the basis of what she does in other organizations. That's her podium, that's her foundation. And it's what she calls motherhood regeneration. Dr. Barrett believed that no matter the circumstances on a woman becoming a mother, you were a mother. And that unwed mothers should not be shunned. In fact, they should be helped. And part of the way that she saw helping them was through Christian education, but also by providing the skills that they would need to take care of themselves and their children. And as you can might imagine, this was in some ways not considered very proper work for an upper middle class woman of that time period. Dr. Barrett was a Virginian. Let me go right away to this photograph. She was a Virginian. Her family, a Confederate-leaning family. Her early life was very disrupted by the Civil War. This photograph shows her with a number of the children at one of the Florence Crittenden Mission Homes. And the reason I really started on this project is because this is the image on one of our exhibition panels at Fairfax Museum. And it's entitled, Dr. Kate Waller Barrett, Mother to Many. But in recent times, every time I pass by, I say, there's more to this. There's more to this story. So when I saw Amber's call for papers, I said, well, here's my opportunity to look at some other things that Dr. Barrett was involved with. And this is Dr. Barrett as a young woman and her husband, Reverend Robert South Barrett, who was an Episcopal minister. She, like Ida B. Wells, seemed to have a singular incident in their young lives that prompted them to activism in some way. For Dr. Barrett, it was when she and her husband were assigned to an Episcopal church in a slum area of Richmond, that she had a knock on the door one night from a young woman, a young unmarried mother with her baby, asking for help. That time, Dr. Barrett was also a young mother, and she said, from then on, I knew I had to stretch out my hand to help the unfortunate that time. And she did. The Barretts moved, as ministers do, to churches in Kentucky and then to Atlanta. And in Atlanta, she said, I need some medical training. I can't do this without knowing more about health and medical practices. So she earned a 3-year degree at the Women's College, Medical College of Georgia. And of course, a very unusual thing for that time period for a woman to become a physician. She never put out her shingle and advertised for patients, but instead she used her medical knowledge with the Florence Crittenden Mission Homes organization. And this is, excuse me, one of the ads in the newspaper showing the homes, as well as the image on the bottom is of Charles Crittenden. Dr. Barrett's family was not poor, but they didn't have that much money. But Charles Crittenden, a New Yorker, had made a huge fortune at that time in pharmaceuticals. And after his 4-year-old daughter, Florence, died of scarlet fever, he went through a religious transformation, and the rest of his life he devoted to helping unmarried women and particularly prostitutes in New York. So Dr. Barrett had the medical knowledge and the willpower, and Mr. Crittenden had the funding for that. And this is Dr. Barrett's family with her 6 children shortly after the death of her husband in 1896. And again, there's some similarities here with Ida B. Wells. She's also a mother. She's doing all this public work with the responsibilities of a wife and being a wife and now a widow with six children. His son, Dr. Barrett's son, another Robert South Barrett, quoted his father as saying on his deathbed that a lot of men could preach, but there were few women who could do the work that Dr. Barrett was intended to do. So again, she had a very supportive husband. And as I said, there were over 70 homes established across the United States. I'm using this image because this is the one in Tennessee from Chattanooga. I didn't find that there was a home here in Knoxville, but that would be the closest one. And Dr. Barrett, after her husband died, she moved back to Virginia to be near her family, and then the headquarters for the National Florence Crittenden Mission was established in Washington, D.C. So it sort of puts her right near the center of power at that point. And she used those connections. One of the first issues that she got involved with, which is linked to the Florence Crittenden Mission but broadened her approach, was white slavery. Has anyone heard that term? Okay, today we're probably talking about it as human trafficking. So it was an issue then, and it's an issue now. And Dr. Barrett was able to postpone the closure of what was called the then segregated district, and I'm not talking about race, but a segregated district in Washington, D.C. of brothels and bars and what they called houses of vice. So in the early 20th century, most large cities had these sections, but they decided to close the one in Washington, D.C., and so what Dr. Barrett did, and again, she's not just putting out problems, but she's trying to find solutions here. She said, if you close the district, give me time to find other housing for the 400 women who were there. And so as you can see, the newspaper coverage on the left says that she's able to postpone President Wilson signing the bill until she's able to find homes for the women who are willing to leave and to do so. She also continued her work on white slavery or human trafficking as an appointee, a government appointee with the Bureau of Immigration. They appointed her as a special agent to investigate because they thought most women who were involved in this white slavery were newly arrived immigrant women or brought to the United States for that purpose. So Dr. Barrett sailed on a ship with some of the women who were being deported so she could actually interview them and talk to them and find out what the situation was. And then she traveled throughout Europe, met with government officials, and was even able to help negotiate some country-to-country agreements on this human trafficking. And also back when she returned to the United States, the Bureau of Immigration balked at putting her recommendations into place because they said, we don't have women officers to oversee the women who were waiting to be heard in court. Dr. Barrett said, okay, hire women. And the current historian with the Department of Labor credits her with opening up that department for employment for women. And sorry about this, is a little grainy, but this is an image of a suffrage booth in Richmond. She was a founding member of what was called the Equal Suffrage League of Virginia, and also a member of national suffrage organizations. And she is listed as one of the organizers for the parade that Ida B. Wells participated in Washington, D.C. And I'm still looking to see if I can connect them in any way, but they were certainly moving in that same circle and being involved in that event. She also joined with fellow women reformers to form the Women's Peace Party in 1915. And again, Dr. Barrett, using her platform of motherhood, was against war. She thought that mothers and children paid the biggest price for war, and that they should have a say-so in being able to stop conflicts. And as we know, the war in Europe eventually engulfed the United States in 1917. And once the declaration of war was issued, then Barrett began looking at what she could do. And so she oversaw some of the registration bureaus to get women involved in war work. She was also very much outspoken about the anti-German feeling in our country at the time. And I think this goes back to her work and liaison with immigrant women. So she was really, she said, ashamed that our country, for one thing, they took away the citizenship of American women who were married to non-citizens from some of the countries, such as Italy, Germany. And she worked with Jeannette Rankin on this. I'm sure you all know the name Jeannette Rankin. Another thing that she did during World War I is she was appointed to go around to the different Army training posts and to talk to the men about the dangers of venereal disease. She was very much outspoken, very frank about sex, particularly for a woman at that time period. And I have not found a picture of her at one of the, sorry, I slipped through that's the suffrage parade in Washington, D.C. I haven't found a photograph of her with one of these talks at military posts, but if you can just imagine, she's a middle-aged woman going in and talking with the men. And this is a picture of her with some sailors at that time. And at war's end, once the war was over, she joined with other reformers. She attended the Zurich Peace Conference. This is a grainy photo again, but she's seated on the left, if you can see there on the left. Jane Addams is in the front row, the second from the left there. And World War I, in its aftermath with disabled veterans, offered her another outreach. She got very involved in veterans issues, seeking better care, rehabilitation, service clubs for the men. And she was also very interested in helping the wives of servicemen. I think this picture shows her with some of the German wives who are arriving in the United States. And part of that work came through her helping to found the Women's Auxiliary of the American Legion. And she was president of Virginia, and then she also served as the national president of the auxiliary. Dr. Barrett was also interested in education. She felt that education and equality were two tenets that needed to be put in place in American society. She served as the second woman on the Board of Visitors for the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia. And today there is a hall called Barrett Hall. I don't know if any William and Mary graduates in the audience, but a lot of people I've talked to at William and Mary have no idea of why that hall is named Barrett Hall. She also was interested in education for both white students and African American students. She was part of the Congress of Mothers. That's now the Parent Teachers, evolved into the Parent Teachers Association. And she spoke several times at those groups on providing better facilities for what was then the term for colored students. And she was interested in a specific type of education, and that was sex education or family life education. And she urged, and I'll quote here, fathers and mothers to cast aside their pride and frankly teach their sons and daughters the responsibilities of sex. Now, Jane Addams, in her story, she called the 1920s, which we look at 1920s as kind of the end of the progressive era, as the 20s she called a decade of sad and sag. But Dr. Barrett, it may have changed that whole swirl of reform movements, but Dr. Barrett went on to get involved in a number of organizations and outreach opportunities, political activism in the 1920s. The image on the screen now is from the 1924 Democratic Convention in New York, and with this research I've had to revise also our interpretation in Fairfax. Dr. Barrett's shown on the right. Again, it's from a newspaper image. And we have been saying that she was the first woman to address a national political convention. So I'll have to say, how many people from Tennessee here? All right. Actually, you get the honor. She spoke on the same day, but a woman from Tennessee spoke before Dr. Barrett. So Tennessee gets that honor. They had a Women's Day at the convention where they had women from different states do seconding nominations for what were called favorite son candidates. And the favorite son candidate from Virginia is the man on the left at the top, Senator Carter Glass. Now, in the newspapers, after Dr. Barrett's speech, they gave her great press, saying that she gained the biggest ovation of the day, and used this headline, Grandma Barrett, seconder of class, thinking flapper is what they called her. And the next day in the paper, she made her retort. And I'm going to quote that because I think it shows some of her personality. Quote, years don't mean much. If you think you are a flapper, you are just as much of a flapper as a 16-year-old. I've never had so much fun in my life before since my hair turned white. The best part of that is that a woman with lots of years can be so open and honest. Another outlet of Dr. Barrett in the 1920s was an extension of the Florence Crittenden mission to a rural farm in Fairfax County. And as you might imagine, this is how I come into the story here. This farm is called Ivacota. It was a 364-acre farm in southwest Fairfax County. which was actually donated to the Florence Crittenden mission. And Dr. Barrett, coming from a rural background herself, saw this as an opportunity to have a place where women could be taught other skills, such as canning and growing things in the garden, and different things that you couldn't do in the urban homes. The farm at Ivacota also shows her close liaison with African-American reformer Janie Porter Barrett. I don't know if anyone knows that name or not. She was born in Georgia, educated at the Hampton Institute in Virginia, and fought for many of the same things with African Americans that Dr. Barrett was lobbying for. And Mrs. Porter had also a similar, what they called the Virginia Industrial School for Colored Girls outside of Richmond on about 150 acres. And Barrett and Porter had many of the same tenets and procedures with their homes, what the girls were taught, the structure. So they're just very similar farms at that time, separated by about 90 miles. And Dr. Barrett served on the Board of Trustees for the Virginia Industrial School for girls. And I think this shows her liaison with another Barrett, and also her service to that school really shows her willingness and investment at that time in collaborating across very segregated race lines in Virginia. This is another photograph from Ivacota, a little later one, and it's starting in the early 1920s and extending on after Dr. Barrett's death. It also becomes a center where Fairfax County court will sentence young women too. It's more like a young women's juvenile detention center at that time. And that's why you see all except one girl who looks around a little bit, but it shows them from the back with Dr. Barrett on the left. In the 1920s, also, we had several different centennial events in our country: the Centennial of the Monroe Doctrine, the Centennial of the Marquis de Lafayette's visit, and Dr. Barrett got very involved in those through her participation as a member of the Daughters of the American Revolution. One thing about Dr. Barrett is she always had overlapping agendas. She didn't approach a problem with just sort of one idea. She would look at something and say, well, what can I do then? If I establish a home for women, I'm just not going to have them there. What can I do to help them? What can I do when they leave the home, for example? And that was part of what earlier when she had put daycare in as part of the operation in the mission home. And in 1923, I think this is a good example. She seized the opportunity to both preserve history and expand the mission at Ivacota. And that's with the National Florence Crittenden Mission's purchase of what was called in the Washington Star newspaper the most historic landmark in Fairfax, Virginia, built in 1792 out of bricks from the early colonists. And she was able to step in and stop another purchaser. One purchaser wanted to tear the house down and build a bus garage there. And Dr. Barrett again said no. She needed the house to extend the mission of the Ivacota farm. This would be an in-town place. It's 2 blocks from the county courthouse where the women could come. They could stay there while they were waiting for their court appearances. And also it would be a sales outlet where they could sell all the goods and products that they were growing and raising at the farm. She also saw an opportunity to extend historic preservation. As I said, she'd been interested in different centennial observances. She's also involved with an early folklore effort. She wanted to save early African American music from Virginia. So she had a range of historic preservation interests. And the reason, a second reason that she wanted to preserve this house was that at the time, until the 1990s, people thought this structure was much older, that it had been someplace where George Washington had stayed. So again, she's combining her mission with her heritage and historic preservation interests. However, Barrett's plans were not completed for the house due to her unexpected death in February 1925. She suffered from diabetes and then died of a heart attack. And at that time, newspapers covered her widely at her death, as they had during her life. And all the organizations that she'd been a part of, from the American Legion to the National Council of Women to then the League of Women Voters, they all send in lots of flowing tributes, calling her a warrior at heart, saying she had the ability to work successfully with diverse groups, and she blended a remembrance of the past with the needs of the present. And this is Barrett Hall at the College of William and Mary. The building was under construction at her death, and after her death, they decided immediately to name it Barrett Hall, and it's still part of that campus. Virginia Governor Elbert Lee Trinkle called Barrett the most distinguished woman of our time from the standpoint of years of service and wonderful achievements. And he made the order to lower the flag over the Virginia State Capitol to half-staff, the first time a woman was so honored. And in addition to Barrett Hall, there are a number of other cultural institutions in Virginia that carry her name, including libraries and elementary schools. So let's look at Barrett and race for just a minute. I mentioned some of her outreaches there. The Florence Crittenden Mission Homes, some of the homes in the north were integrated over time. The foundation also brought in, as part of the general mission, what was called the Topeka Colored Home in Topeka, Kansas, and made that a full part of the Florence Crittenden mission. She certainly, as records show, worked with Janie Porter Barrett on the industrial school outside of Richmond. But I haven't found any documents or records that show that she ever publicly opposed or attempted to disrupt segregation in any way. And certainly that puts her kind of in the context, I think, of other female reformers of the progressive period, and historians have concluded who did not really seriously challenge the color code, and certainly distance her from the activism of Ida B. Wells, the woman in focus today. However, the records do show a lot of commonalities in their lives. Both women, as I said, balanced the responsibilities of work and home. When Dr. Barrett was getting her medical degree, it's recorded that she often took 4 children with her to classes, and Ida B. Wells, of course, took young children to meetings and things frequently. While Barrett was not a crusading journalist in any way, she realized the power of her words, both her written words and her oratory, and her ability to use that to make a difference. And also, I think Barrett shares a lot of commonalities with Jane Addams of that time period. Both Addams and Barrett were involved in a lot of different issues, from the suffrage campaign, and there is a record from 1905 of actually Dr. Barrett and Jane Addams sharing the podium here in Knoxville at a suffrage meeting. Both of those women, Adams and Barrett, were well-traveled, certainly. They had no problems with sailing off to Europe. Dr. Barrett made 22 trips back and forth to Europe. And they were both, I think, at ease in operating with many different colleagues of different nationalities and backgrounds. Their personal life certainly is very different. As a mother of 6 children, Dr. Barrett based her platforms and podiums, no matter what group she was a part of, as being a mother. She thought that was the best role someone could have, and so she was always on the lookout for getting involved with anything that would lead to the equality of the sexes. She believed in balancing equality and responsibility. Both men and women had responsibilities in public as well as their private lives. And in some of the personal letters that she wrote that are in our collection, she also a lot of times writes very philosophically about the non-existent borders that separate countries. One letter, she was standing on the border with the United States and Canada, and she said, except for a small stone saying this is the border, I can't see a difference. The same grass is waving. The children are playing the same games on each side of the border. So she had a very, I think, international outlook with this. And just to conclude, historians have looked at Dr. Barrett's work, particularly Catherine Aiken. Her book, Harnessing the Power of Motherhood, was printed by the University of Tennessee Press. And although Aiken herself lives in Idaho. But some of the study that I have undertaken for this paper, it's involved other sources and other records, particularly newspapers, the unprocessed personal documents at the Library of Congress, and of course the digital sources, the new media. So there's a lot more out there to tell us about Dr. Barrett than some of the earlier historians had access to. But I believe that Dr. Barrett is an example of someone using political savvy, personality, knowledge, organizational skills. But in no way would I say that she's a radical. I think she's more of a compromising person, a collaborator, someone who wants to get along. But she operated in the highest national and international circles of all the reform movements of that progressive era, while she's still rooted, I believe, in her Southern culture and certainly very much with her Episcopal faith. And why is she not well known? Why didn't any of us know? I never heard about her until I started working in Fairfax 15 years ago. I had heard of Ida B. Wells, I have to say. And I think she is viewed now as being really a rigid moral personality, which has lost some of its favor over the years. She had a strong opposition to divorce and remarriage, and also some of her outreach at the time just wasn't so popular, and our society has moved on with different views about women, and particularly services and things that are available to unmarried mothers. But I think she was a model for female reformers. I think she certainly reconciled professional ideals with the values from that female reform movement. And that's a quote from another historian. And what I would like to end with is that I think that her whole life of promoting and engaging in social, political, and economic reforms across race and class lines certainly measured up to her husband's declaration that she had a unique ability to do that. And I would like to recommend, particularly to young historians here, that her achievements really deserve a reevaluation in light of the multiple disciplinary approaches that she took, the organization she contributed to, and urge continued scholarship on Dr. Kate Waller Barrett, who is really more than a mother to many. Thank you. I'm trying to
You don't need to close it.
escape. Okay. Okay.
I can just
All right.
open
Okay.
mine.
You open yours. All right.
Should see, yeah. First, for the National History Day folks, I'll give you a little hint. I've judged the local, state, and national level several times, and I'm here for 24 hours, so feel free to bug me. Bribing judges doesn't work. Sorry. Amber and others, thank you for having me come here because I've been on the road for about a month. I have a new book out about the sort of 20th century Ida B. Wells, The Life of Ethel Payne. And usually what the reaction of audiences is who's Ethel? You know, one of the points I've made to audiences over and over again is that segregation in the United States may be less endemic, as Obama made the point about violence when he was at Selma recently, but segregation in history continues to an extraordinary extent. And so one of my missions in writing this book was to try to expose a larger audience to Ethel Payne. And tomorrow at lunch, I'm going to tell you the story of Ethel Payne. Today, my remarks are going to be different, but I just want to share with you, because it's fun for me, as I said, part of my mission was to get Ethel Payne's story known, and because of our neat communication devices, I just got an email a few minutes ago. And this weekend, when the New York Times publishes its list of best-selling books on race and civil rights for February, Ethel Payne's story is now on it. So she's getting known. Clap for Ethel Payne. It's a story that told itself. What I wanted to do in my presentation with this panel is focus on the words of alternative reform movements. I'm changing that a little bit because I want you to consider the black press as a reform movement, even though in many ways it might regard itself as a reform institution. And because there are folks here who know the history and then there are folks who don't know the history, those who do, bear with me when I tell you some stuff you already know. And again, also because you don't know Ethel Payne's life, and I'm telling her life tomorrow, I'll fill in some little things. But I wanted to start at least with a photograph of her showing you in her perhaps most favored position. She traveled the world extensively, and that's a photograph of her in front of the Air Force One on one of her many trips. Ethel Payne began her reporting life in the 1950s, joining the White House press corps as a reporter for the Chicago Defender. And the story I'm going to tell today really relates to the importance of discussing who has a seat at the table and who controls the story in media, which is very much parallel to Ida Wells's experience in terms of trying to bring the horrors of lynching to a larger audience. And so part of the background is Ethel Payne grew up in South Side Chicago in the shadow of the Chicago Defender. And this morning we heard of the Chicago Defender being referred to as a Chicago black newspaper, which is true. But the New York Times is not merely a New York paper, and the Chicago Defender was not merely a Chicago paper. It had tremendous influence and national exposure. And it comes out of a history of the black press that dates back at least to 1827. There's the Freedom Journal, and the Baltimore Afro-American that's still going, and the Washington Afro-American. And these papers combined a kind of advocacy journalism, which I'll talk about in a second, as a legacy of what Ida B. Wells did. But I want you to consider what grew up in her shadow, in the sense that at the end of her life, what was happening was the perhaps larger role that the black press would play in changing American society. And it was built upon the fact that it's a byproduct, in a sense, of segregation. Northern cities like Chicago were so deeply segregated when Ethel Payne was born in 1911. The Chicago Defender was started about 6 years earlier than that. And blacks were so excluded from opportunities, social work or whatever, that Bronzeville, as part of Southside, is nicknamed, created their own institutions. They said, you know, screw you white folks, if you're not going to let us participate, we'll build our own. So you had your own cosmetic companies, your own banks, your own taxi cab companies who could pick you up, and importantly, your own newspapers. And the economic basis of this that allowed the Defender to rise to become a national paper is the exclusion of papers like the Chicago Tribune. The Chicago Tribune covered nothing to do with the black community in Chicago, except, of course, if there was a crime. And then there'd be a disparaging comment using words that you wouldn't use in the press today about this crime. So being excluded from that, there was no high school sports scores, no funeral announcements, no wedding announcements, none of the things that are kind of the currency of a local paper. And the Chicago Defender thus created this economic basis for existing because it could get advertisers if it was in demand. And it made possible Ethel Payne's work as a journalist. But part of the story involves another alternative aspect that went on back then. If you recognize, these are Pullman porters. And I flew here yesterday, but if I were coming to this conference a century ago, as a professional, I would have traveled on an overnight train. And you would have had a wonderful little bed, and you would have been serviced by these men who are Pullman porters, and A. Philip Randolph, of course, famously organized them. Well, you remember I mentioned the Chicago Defender being a national paper. It circulated down here and other southern states, but at an enormous risk. There were actually counties that made it against the law to get the Defender. But you know the difference between de jure and de facto life. If you were an African American in the South, law wasn't always the problem. It could be extra legal measures that might be taken if you were seen carrying the Chicago Defender. Why was the Chicago Defender so threatening to white segregationists in the South? 2 reasons. And this is, again, it so relates to the kind of advocacy journalism Ida B. Wells was doing, in that the kind of feudal existence meant that if you were a tenant farmer here, you might not know what's going on in Mississippi or in Alabama. There was not, there's not that kind of coverage available to you. So the Chicago Defender was reporting the horrors in the South at the same time as they were reporting the potentially better life in the North. And if you've read Isabel Wilkinson's book, The Warmth of Other Suns, you know how important the Defender became as a kind of active invitation to come north. Trust me, I researched Southside Chicago. It wasn't a glorious place to live, but it was far better than what was being offered in the South. So the Chicago Defender played this role, but you couldn't subscribe to it by the mail, so these Pullman porters would bring the newspapers south with them in bundles, leave them, and often they'd end up in barbershops. And on Saturdays, when men would come in for their weekly shave and haircut, they would pick up a copy of the Defender, bring it home, and 6 or 7 people would read it. So this is the shadow in which Ethel Payne began her life, and I'll tell you more about what happened when she went to Japan in 1948, when troops were desegregated. And in fact, if you know your story, General MacArthur refused to listen to anything Truman ordered, so he didn't desegregate her troops, and she ended up working his troops. So she ended up working for a black service club. But let's get back to this business of who has a seat. She begins her life at a late period of professional life, at age 41, working with the Chicago Defender. Those of you who know history know that's Adlai Stevenson. There she is with Roy Wilkins. The man on the far right is Louis Martin. Louis Latour, the first African-American accredited to the White House Press Corps. He's a Republican, very nervous about asking tough questions. Ethel Payne and Alice Dunningham are the women who take on asking tough questions. And I was struck by something this morning, a discussion of women and what a difference it makes who's writing copy and saying things. I'm jumping back, but I can't resist but share this. I quickly went to look this up in the book. When Ethel Payne was getting trained as a reporter, in the 1950s, when she's like me, a late bloomer. I was a late bloomer because I was lazy. She was a late bloomer because every job opportunity was being denied to her. But she finally becomes a reporter. She's getting her teeth cut covering Chicago stuff, and she's writing stories about black orphanages in Chicago. This is the stuff that's not appearing in the Chicago Tribune. For instance, this is a world where, just to give you a taste of it, if you were a white family and adopted a child in Chicago, and discovered later that there might be some black heritage in that child, like a defective good at Kmart, you could return, Walmart, you could return the child. So it just gives you a sense of the imbalance that existed. But, we were talking this morning about sexual crimes on women and who bears the burdens and stuff. This is something Ethel Payne wrote in the 1950s in one of her first articles. She's talking about the opinions of social workers and highlighted the stigma borne by these women, not unlike Hester Prynne's Scarlet Letter. Today, a century later, she writes, it is still a woman who pays and pays for the crime of bastardy because the cruel, inequitable fallacy still exists that it's the woman's fault in all cases. This is 1950. So, you know, this whole notion of who is shaping our story makes an enormous difference in gender alone. So anyway, I'm going to give you a couple examples from her career. When she's in the White House Press Corps, she's asking this man, Eisenhower, really tough questions about civil rights, and I'll enumerate them tomorrow because it's a terrific story. But one of the points she discovered, and I want you to understand the act of courage. She's black and she's female in a highly segregated city. I mean, Washington, D.C. finding a bathroom in 1952 or 53 that she could go to was a tough problem. So she gets up in the back of the press hall and she begins to ask tough questions of Eisenhower. And what does she see? She sees a sea of white male faces turning around and looking at her. And she's going to have the gumption as a female and as an African-American female to ask a tough question of the president. And she does. And I'll enumerate the questions tomorrow because it's a great tale. But what she learns then is by asking a question at a national press conference, it forces the mainstream white media to report on the topics that they're not talking about. It changes the national agenda. So merely the press's power to ask questions that are not being asked is a far more powerful thing that we don't think about. And so she would ask questions that the white press hadn't covered. The next day, the Washington Post and New York Times were forced to write stories based on some inequity that she might have uncovered. For instance, the Howard Choir being closed out of something, or interstate desegregation and interstate bus travel. Is that within the federal government's powers? So the notion of who asks those questions, who has a seat, is terribly important. But another role she played, this is a moment when Eisenhower gets really ticked off at her. He also, and if you're really interested in this, and you want to hear it, last Friday, NPR ran a story about my book and Ethel Payne, and what's so cool about it, it's available on web, is you can hear the Eisenhower recording. And if you go, just Google Ethel Payne NPR, there's a whole page now devoted to her and what she did. But I want to stick to this theme of alternative institutions that are focusing, I've got 4 minutes, okay. When Rosa Parks sat in the wrong place, so to speak, and Martin Luther King and Abernathy and others were leading this movement in Montgomery, she was among the first to go there. And this is a classic example of why she's an alternative figure. The white press hadn't picked up on the story. If Martin Luther King was mentioned in the newspapers, it was M.L. King. They didn't know who he was. And when Ethel Payne went to Montgomery, she discovered on ground zero, which is why, you know, we as historians can tell you this is the turning point. Keep in mind, she's a journalist seeing things happen. She's discovering that the movement of the black freedom struggle had shifted from people like Du Bois, then from labor leaders like A. Philip Randolph, with whom she worked, to Thurgood Marshall, legal folks. Now it's moving to men of the cloth. This new gladiator goes into battle wearing a reverse collar and holding a Bible in his hand. May seem like light, frivolous conversation. No, she's reporting a profound change that's going to lead to the nonviolence movement that's going to bring about the change, and she saw that on the ground. Now, why that's significant is keep in mind who her readers are. The press is so segregated back then that 85% of the American public has no idea about the Chicago Defender, but who does are black readers. It's not an accident that Martin Luther King would end up going to Chicago to raise money, because black readers of the Chicago Defender knew what was going on. So she acts as a conduit in a form of advocacy journalism, linking what's going on at the front lines to the civil rights movement to readers back home, and thus in turn activating them. And this is one of the great powers of journalism has. She doesn't have to do like Fox, use inflammatory vocabulary. All she has to do is be reporting on these kinds of things. And then she does something quite profound. She begins to realize that the black freedom struggle here in the United States is connected to a larger struggle for self-determination around the world. These are photographs of the Bandung Conference, which scared, which scared the heck out of white folks in the United States, because these were folks of color who were going to meet without inviting the United States and without inviting USSR, and she wanted to be there for this. So she thought the black freedom struggle in the United States was much part of a larger struggle, and she wanted to connect her readers to that, sent her exclusive photographs and that sort of thing. And let's see. Yeah, I got 3 minutes. Okay. So I'm really going at high speed. The last thing about her that I want you to take from this is how different her coverage and the black press coverage was of the major legislative and civil rights battles, as well as Supreme Court. If you notice these people in this picture, John F. Kennedy on the far left, Hubert Humphrey in the middle, and LBJ, Majority Leader, on the right. This is the 1957 Civil Rights Act. Now, if you buy your high school version of civil rights progress, John F. Kennedy and LBJ are these great advocates of civil rights who bring about the '64 Civil Rights Act bill. At that moment, they're gutting the bill. They're running for president. Both of them are running for president. They think that being too much in favor of the Negro causes, as they might view it at that point, was a disability that they didn't want to bring to a national forum. So who's reporting it? Ethel Payne is reporting it to her black readers because she nails them as they come off the floor and talks about how we stood by and watched Johnson gut this bill. And this is profound because what happens is if you compare the white press's coverage to the black press's coverage of the 57 Civil Rights Act, 64 Civil Rights Act, or the 65 Voting Rights Act, they're viewed as munificent gifts being given, notice the kind of passive notion, to African Americans. You view Ethel Payne's coverage, it's like a print version of Selma movie in the fact that these are rights that are owed to us, that belong to us, that we are taking, that we are winning. And so when they failed to accomplish them in movements like that, she was always the first to report it. And that's one of the legacies that we have of the segregated press. And so one of the aspects, I think one of the unexplored aspects of the civil rights movement is that connectivity, as one reporter referred to, who is still alive when the internet came about, referred to the black press as being our internet. It's the web that held us together. So Ethel Payne was a journalist, but like Ida B. Wells, she was an advocacy journalist in that she was providing this critical information from ground zero, from the front lines, back to folks who could make a difference. And the scene in Selma when all of a sudden Martin Luther King issues this call that the white press reports and white folks from Boston and others come, that's a page from her story. She'd been doing that all along and activating African Americans, completely invisible like all other African American institutions to white America. So in a sense with I'm past my due. That's the connection I find between her and Ida B. Wells. And the one thing I'd leave with is that some people say, well, Ida B. Wells, risked enormous physical danger. And I wouldn't say Ethel Payne risked the same, but I wouldn't underestimate what she risked. Coming to Montgomery, coming to Alabama for the desegregation fight over the University of Alabama, when she was on the campus, can you imagine university officials saying this to somebody today? He looked at her and he said, I cannot guarantee your safety while you're on campus today. And the 3 things that were tough for her coming to the South, she was black, she was a woman, and worst of all, she was a reporter. So, that's my story. Thank you. Oh, I was going to tell you about Richard, but we'll talk about him later.
I'm sorry, bear with me for just a second. Good afternoon, everybody. I just want to echo my colleagues. Thank you so much to Amber and the other coordinators for allowing me to speak with you today. And my piece, like the other 2 that you've heard, is a little bit different. That's why we're under other. Beyond, that's right. Thank you. Yeah. And hopefully you'll make the connection between what I'm going to say and our young budding scholars who are going to go to the Tennessee State History Fair. The title of my paper, as you can see, is What Would Ida Do? Ascerning the relevancy of Ida B. Wells' legacy to journalism students at an HBCU. She would blog, she would tweet, she would take to the streets. these were my speculations as I followed the recent shooting deaths of African-American males such as Michael Ferguson, Trayvon Martin, Jordan Davis, Eric Garner, Sean Bell. Unfortunately, the list goes on, and there are probably some who we don't know about who just haven't managed to generate the same publicity. And of course, it seems that these cases have proliferated in recent years. And as we know, scholarly interest in Wells has also proliferated, thankfully. We have forums such as this. We have the Ida B. Wells Initiative here at UT Knoxville. We have work such as those by Dr. Bay and Giddings that was mentioned, and others. So knowledge about Ida B. Wells continues to grow, and for that I'm sure that we're all grateful. Now, to me, an Ida B. Wells performer, long time ago, an assistant professor of speech and a sometimes adjunct assistant professor of journalism at an HBCU in the South, which shall go unnamed, my thoughts recently were, well, I mean, I taught a journalism class this past fall, and this was when we started the class about maybe a month or so after the Brown verdict. And so my thoughts were, okay, this is fresh in the news. I'm teaching these budding journalists of color. You know, what are their thoughts about this? And of course, because I love Ida B. Wells, I'm trying to always insert her in everything. So my thought was, too, do they potentially see a connection at all? And so, well, in the class, just to back up a little bit, it's Language Skills for Media Professionals. That's the name of the class. And, you know, just listening to the discussion earlier today after the first panelist, just about education on Wells in general, that's basically where I was at that point in time last fall. So now really just attempting to find out what they might possibly think, I assigned the students in this Gatekeeper entry-level course in the journalism school a couple of research questions. Let's see. First, what, if any, is the relevancy of Ida B. Wells Barnett's crusade for justice to the Trayvon Martin, Jordan Davis, or Michael Brown cases? And then secondly, what are the implications of Wells's crusade, if any, for today's journalists? All righty. Now, my research questions were a little bit different from the questions that I assigned to the students, but they basically address the same areas. My questions were, how do the students frame their arguments relating to their perceived relevancy, if any, of Wells's legacy to the recent shooting deaths of African-American males by whites? And then secondly, how do these students frame their arguments? That's what the key was for me, relating to their perceptions of Wells's relevancy, if any, to today's journalists. And I sought to do this via discourse analysis of the student papers. They were assigned to write a 500-word paper. As you know, that's about 2 pages or so, double spaced, using a minimum of 5 primary sources. But now first, and getting back to the earlier panel discussion just on education in general about Wells and how it's pretty much lacking or non-existent, I said, have you ever heard of Ida B. Wells? Just kind of randomly. Of course, it wasn't random, but I'm sure it seemed random to them. And I had some just kind of look at me, like they were like, well, I might have heard that name before, and then some kind of nodded maybe a little bit more confidently. And I just said, well, you know, I'm going to just, you know, take you out of your suspense and, you know, let you know who this person was. So now what I did, I showed them, and a lot of you guys may be familiar with this great documentary, Ida B. Wells, A Passion for Justice. And it's pretty old now, but very, very good. I showed them that. And after that, immediately after the viewing, I said to them, guess what you're going to be doing? Somebody said, we have an assignment on Ida B. Wells. I said, you got it. So again, I gave them that assignment. I gave them about 2 months to finish it. And the reason that I had them focus on either the Martin, Davis, or Brown cases is because those were the cases that had generated the most recent publicity. The Eric Garner case at that time had not really, gotten the publicity that it would later get. So I chose to focus on those cases. And also, I wanted to make sure that they understood the difference between primary and secondary sources, because you can't take that for granted, as you know, being an educator. And they didn't. So we talked about, okay, what's the difference there? And these are the types of sources that I would like you to focus on. And of course, I'm just showing pictures of Brown, as in the previous slide, and this is Jordan Davis. Okay, and just to jump ahead a little bit, there were 39 students enrolled in the class. I got 36 back, so not everybody turns in their work. And of those, I divided the papers into those that most clearly addressed the first question and those that most clearly addressed the second question. So that eliminated some further. And then I did another round of elimination because I wanted to focus on the papers that most eloquently expressed the students' points of view. So now from those, and so the final groupings were 12 more clearly addressing the first research question, and then 6 that more clearly addressed the second research question. And regarding the first research question, discourse fragments that students used in their papers, such as the word lynch or its derivatives, lynching, racial profiling, murder, etc., suggested to me that students find a direct connection between what is going on now with the shooting deaths of African American males and what was going on in Wells's time. Students the discourse fragments suggest that they don't differentiate. They consider what's going now is just updated lynching. The difference being that people are no longer being hung from trees, but they're being shot. And with no recourse for victims, their families, the criminal justice system, they see no difference. And what I found interesting about this group as well was a fourth of the students credited Wells with originating the protest slogan, "No justice, no peace." And I'm going to talk about that a little bit further, a little bit later. And then in terms of those papers that more clearly address the second research question, discourse fragments like Crusader, Advocate, etc., suggested to me that students find Wells's legacy relevant to today's journalists. Just the fact that they used terms such as this to describe her would indicate to me that would suggest to me that they consider these traits to be desirable in journalists today. And then another thing that I found interesting about this group was that most of them, 4 out of the 6, connected Wells's work with today's social media, as Mr. McGrath mentioned. Alrighty. And I want to, just to back up a little bit, let me see. Okay, just to give you a little bit of context, again, I teach at an HBCU in the South, which shall remain unnamed. Okay, big secret. But you know why I'm doing it, okay? It has one of the top-rated journalism programs among HBCUs. As a matter of fact, it had one of the first accredited journalism programs among HBCUs nationally. And currently, there are majors in public relations, journalism, and graphic design. The mission statement of the journalism school reads in part, "We endeavor to help shape our students into ethically and socially responsible leaders." So I said to myself, okay, well, let me try to help you with that a little bit. Again, the course is called Language Skills for Media Well, initially it was called Language Skills for Journalists. Everybody has those gatekeeper courses. Then the name was changed to Media Professionals because I think they realized, well, if you say journalism, some people go into advertising or whatever, so they kind of expanded it, but basically still the same course. As a matter of fact, if you go to the catalog, it still has the old name there. But if you go to the website, they have the new name. You know how these things go. Diverse majors were in my class, but mostly the students identified as pre-journalism. All right? They have to earn a C or higher in the class to move up. And the course description reads in part, practicing the application of basic grammar principles needed to practice effective journalistic writing. And really what we try to do in the J School, because we don't have a media history course per se, what the professors generally try to do is just to incorporate media history into their existing courses, particularly mass media and society. We just try to, get it in there however we can. And this project was part of that effort. Okay. Oh, what happened? John? Technical difficulties. I'm so glad you have John. Some of us are challenged.
Oh, too far. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks.
Just arrow down to it.
Okay. I want to share with you some examples of student discourse. Okay? One, we'll start off with examples from those that related to Wells's relevancy in the recent shooting deaths of African American males. And this one reads, this is a hard paper to write. Reading the Red Record, the Memphis Diary, and on lynchings made me sick in the stomach for a while. And I still don't get it. What? You ask me if there is any relevancy to Sister Ida Wells's crusade for justice to the Michael Brown case, and are there any implications for today's journalists? What? So we take this little excursion on the time machine and arrive at the conclusion that post-Reconstruction has lingered on into 2014, and with that comes another calling for another crusade for justice. Blacks as well as whites knows, sick, all of this already, sick. What? Okay, so that was one student's reaction. Okay, here was another answering that question. Her, Wells's, in brackets, findings still resonate in present-day America. The tragic ending of Emmett Till in 1955 wasn't the last we would see of that type of lawlessness. In 2013, the shooting death of Trayvon Martin, I think it was actually 2012, the shooting death of Trayvon Martin would ignite a fire in the African American community that hadn't been seen since the days of Emmett Till. Soon after Martin's case, we would find many more black men being killed by the hands of law enforcement and other white men. So that was another student response. And then moving on to those more clearly addressing the second research question, let's see, which had to do again with Wells's relevancy to today's journalists. Here's another student response. She, meaning Wells, was committed to getting the information out to the public, and that's a mentality that all journalists should have today. Additionally, Wells was fearless. What today's journalists can receive from Wells's life-threatening experience is that not everyone is going to agree with what you write. However, you can't allow this to stop you in your crusade for whatever you believe in. And then I thought I would also share some student responses that had to do with no justice, no peace, with some of them crediting her with that protest slogan. Here's one. Now, this student is quoting Wells, all right? This is not their words. This is from the Memphis Diary, but this is how they came to credit her with originating that slogan. So these are Wells's words. I have firmly believed all along that the law was on our side and would, when we appeal to it, give us justice. I feel shorn of that belief and utterly discouraged. And just now, if it were possible, would gather my race in my arms and fly away with them. Oh God, is there no redress, no peace, no justice in this land for us? So the student quoted that, and then the student continued, in my opinion, God heard her plea. He would grant Ida the talents of speech and writing to use as weapons against those who would lynch and perpetrate injustices against African Americans. Okay? And then I'll share with you as well a couple of student responses that really more clearly address the second research question. Okay? She, again meaning Wells, was, excuse me, or was that this? Did I say that already? Bear with me. Okay. Did I share that with you already? I think I did. Okay. So I'm going to move on to social media. I already covered that. Students connected her again with today's social media, with one saying, while social media hasn't brought the shootings to a halt, it has opened the eyes of the uneducated. Ida B. Wells was the social media of her time, informing the community of wrongdoings and asking that her readers become aware. And then another student responded, also having to do with the connection, her connection with today's social media. Journalists today are doing the work that Ida B. Wells did during the 1800s. She wrote books about what was happening. Protesters are using different forms of media to get attention and influence others to make changes. For example, when we write on social networks about how we feel, for example, when we write on social networks about how we feel to get a situation trending, it then gets noticed. And so that was another response. And really, in concluding this, the discourse analysis suggests that students, again, perceive Wells's legacy as being directly relevant to the recent shooting deaths of African American males, such as Martin Davidson Brown. And it also suggests that students find Wells's legacy relevant to the work of journalists today. And again, I was very, I was very fascinated that they credited her with originating that slogan. I actually, as part of my literature review, which I really didn't go into here, but I actually tried to see if I could find the origins of that slogan. And the only thing I found, it dated it as far back as the 1960s, but now we know that's actually not true. Okay. This project, yeah, it just went back to the 1960s, but it didn't trace it back any further than that. Yeah. Projects like this can prove helpful to communication educators who want to help students make connections between the field's past, what's going on today, and not only that, but their professional and personal futures. Thank you so much.
Welcome to the 2015 Ida B. and Beyond Conference, presented by the School of Journalism and Electronic Media at the University of Tennessee. Held in conjunction with the Association for Education in Journalism and Mass Communications 40th Annual Southeast Colloquium. This conference is a component of the Ida B. Wells Initiative, an interdisciplinary project to foster student and scholarly research on Ida B. Wells and other social justice crusaders. The 2015 Ida B. and Beyond Conference is brought to you by UT's Ready for the World program, the Vice Chancellor for Diversity, the Commission for Blacks, the College of Communication and Information at the University of Tennessee, the School of Journalism and Electronic Media, the Department of History, and other private donations.